Okay, so having finished the most difficult chapter, I want to talk a bit about technology and production costs that are associated with how firms produce products. So in the last chapter we derived the demand curve, and we looked at why the demand curve is downward sloping based on the willingness and ability of consumers to buy goods at particular prices. So now we're going to look deeper at the issue of how firms make their decisions, and in some sense it's like talking about why the supply curve is upward sloping. So just to talk about it theoretically at least, before I start writing things out. Why do firms exist? You could say that firms exist for tax purposes, for instance, because they, liability purposes. They they allow a person to take more risk, but not take it personally, right? They can do it under the name of the corporation. And if the corporation fails, then the corporation fails, rather than the person being personally responsible. Or you could say that a firm exists from an economics perspective to what we call minimize transaction costs. What that means is that firms exist so that we gain efficiency by, like if I wanted to start my own university, I would have to hire individuals, I would have to find classrooms, and et cetera, By a single university existing, those transaction costs, those costs of production, fall because we're combining lots of different individuals together. There's probably even an easier way to say why firms exist. And this would be a mantra that you would hear a lot of times in the news, and that would be that firms exist to maximize profits. They maximize profits by maximizing revenues and minimizing costs, with profits being revenue minus costs. Okay, so let's look at those parts of the equation here then. So if we say that firms exist, now I'm going to write my profit as the pi symbol, and you'll see that quite often. If firms exist to maximize profit, then profit, let me get a different marker here, then firms would exist to have the difference between the total revenue and the total cost, that difference be maximized, the profits be maximized, where total revenue is simply the price of the good times the quantity of the good, and that total costs, well, it's a little bit more complicated, but we could say that it is explicit costs, which are kind of like monetary costs, and implicit costs. That would be what we know as the opportunity costs, right? What we could have done instead. So actual things where we actually spend money versus things where its opportunity is lost. Okay, for the most part, we are not going to talk about economic profit. Economic profit would take into account both the explicit and the implicit costs. We're not going to do that here. In the case of the economic profit, it would be total revenue minus cost, both explicit and implicit. We're not going to take that into account. We're generally going to focus on the accounting profit. Those of you who have accounting, this might seem like a very bad memory. So we're only going to take into account explicit costs here. Now, to talk about costs, we're going to need to talk about production. right? Because the cost here is going to be the way in which you are able to design your production process. That's going to affect your costs. And we're actually going to need to break this down into the short run and into the long run. Because in any sort of production technique, there are going to be some things that you can change and some things that you cannot, right? So as a university here, we have some ability to get rid of some employees rather easily, right? They're either not under any long-term contract and they just work by the hour, and so those would be individuals you get rid of rather easily. But there might be employees under long-term employment contracts. They might be tenured, they might be in a union that has a bargaining agreement that doesn't allow you to get rid of them easily. Which means that some things are variable and scalable to the size of your operations, and some things might not be. Just like we might rent a building, near the university, we could get out of that leasing agreement. Whereas there's some buildings that we own, and they're more fixed over time. So that would mean that in the short run, that we have two types of inputs: fixed inputs and variable inputs. Fixed inputs, which as the term implies, the quantity of the inputs does not change over the short run. Outside of all the buildings that we have here on campus, we couldn't immediately come up with new buildings, right? It would take some time. So no matter how much or how little we're trying to do here, the quantity of buildings is relatively fixed. But then there's obviously variable inputs. We can buy more electricity. We can buy more food. There are some things that we can change over time. And we would change those as the output changes, right? So if we got in a flood of 3,000 new students, obviously we would buy more food to feed all these additional students. But we might be, the fixed input would be, where would we put all of these people? Where would they park? Who would teach them? Where would they be taught? Those would be the constraints as imposed by the fixed inputs. Okay. Let's make our life a little easier and think of there just being two inputs in the world: labor and capital. K is going to stand for capital, primarily because Germans were some of the first economists, and capital in the German language starts with a K. So K is going to stand for capital, L is going to stand for labor. And in the short run, we're generally going to think, this is a little bit American here in this sense, that labor is the variable input. We can change it, we can hire people, fire people, but capital is the fixed input. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to draw a picture where the capital stock is fixed. Capital stock meaning capital stock being buildings and machines. And then our quantity of labor is going to be right here. And this is going to be the output of what we're trying to produce. Now, what we're going to see is that what we're going to need to graph out here is what's called the total product and the marginal product. So here's my output good. The total product, the thing that we're producing, the output good. If the only thing that can change is labor, what we're going to initially see here is that the slope, or the slope of this, which would be the marginal product of labor, which would essentially be the change in the output or the change in labor, that at initial points the marginal product of labor is actually increasing at an increasing rate. You're actually able to produce more stuff. The marginal product is actually increasing. The total product would be increasing at an increasing rate. And then your workers are becoming less and less and less productive. So here it is increasing but at a decreasing rate. And then eventually it might even decrease. Now why might it decrease? Because at that point your workers might be stealing, they might be able to get out of going to work because there's so many workers that you have. Here the workers are becoming more productive because you have all these machines but no one to use them. And you get some specialization. By this point you're over specialized. So here would be, if a firm is trying to decide how many workers to hire and how much stuff they need to produce, they're going to look at this and they're going to say, okay, at the initial stages, if I hire workers, they're going to be incredibly productive. The marginal productivity of labor is going to be increasing. This is going to be increasing at an increasing rate, my total productivity. But then eventually the workers are going to become less and less productive. And at some point, they actually might be a harm to the organization. Which would basically mean that if we were to draw the marginal product of labor on a picture, which is essentially say, what if we were to draw just out the slope of this curve in this graph here? Then it would look something like this, right? The slope is increasing, then decreasing, and then can become negative. Becoming negative where this is turning negative. Now, that's going to be useful to us because that's going to allow us to talk about now the cost curves. And there's going to be four types of costs, four major types of costs that we need to talk about. What I'll do is, just for the sake of organizing things, I'll stop the video here and I'll pick it up with costs in the next part of the video.